Both sides knew that winning would be difficult. England knew it would be difficult. They had to cross 4,000 miles of ocean. But the colonials knew it would be difficult because they were facing this nation with the most powerful army and most powerful navy in the world at the time. So the colonials relied on militias. What is a militia? I was part of the militia for 6 years. The militia is basically the National Guard. It's persons who live and work as citizens, but don a uniform, like in my case, once a month. I'd get into uniform and go and drill for 1 week a month. And then during the summer, go to summer camp for 2 weeks of the year. That's a militia. Half-trained troops, not necessarily professional soldiers. But when I was in the Guard, the men in the Guard remind us what they knew. The Revolutionary War was won mostly with militiamen. Men who would fight for a few months, then go home. Join the army for a few months, go home, tend to their crops, tend to their families, then go back and join the army for a few more months. This was a type of men who fought and who won the war for us. Militia. Now, the British had a really difficult time forming a strategy owing to the fact that, if you look at England, on a map, England is fairly small, not even as big as the state of Georgia. Noticeably smaller in the state of Georgia. Whereas the colonies stretched 1,500 miles from the top of what is today Maine, at that time was Massachusetts. From Massachusetts to the southern part of Georgia is about 1,300 miles. I mean, the distances were bigger, and the British could not conceive of those distances, but the distances were so great. And the British had a hard time understanding that, and one of the reasons they lost, and hopefully I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. I'll tell you the end of the story now. The British lost the war. Hopefully all of you knew that before you came to class today. But anyway, one of the reasons was they couldn't understand the distances involved. Yes, the British captured every major port city at one time during the war. They captured Boston, but when they left Boston, the colonials went back in. They captured New York. They captured Philadelphia. They captured most of the Virginia coastline. They captured Charleston, South Carolina. In every case, they take these cities, then they would have to leave them, but to go get something else, and when they leave them, the colonials move back in and take them. Again, they could not be everywhere at once. If the British stayed together, the colonials would operate where they were not. If the British army scattered, the colonials would attack them piecemeal. We'll find out that's what wound up happening. The British army divided itself in two, and the colonials picked out one of the armies and defeated it, and the war ended. Excuse me a moment. All this talking gives me a scratchy throat. All right. Now, here's another mistake that the British made. They really did not get as much help from the Loyalists as they could have, owing to the fact they didn't trust the Loyalists. There was a man named Nathan Hale who joined the British Army, but he joined as an American spy. He was caught and executed, but he was one example. But the British felt like these people who were born in the colonies are going to wind up deserting us anyway, so they did not use as many Loyalists as they otherwise might have. The fact is, if the British would have come over here and only fought with the Loyalists, they could possibly have won the war. The war would have become a civil war between Loyalist and Patriot. The British hesitated to use the Loyalists, so they wound up sending most of their troops that they fought with from England. And in the long run, it hurt them. They didn't get much help from the Loyalists as they could have. Well, realizing the colonies were large, they thought, I know how we'll win. They had a difficult time. It came to a strategy. We're going to divide the colonies. We're going to separate New England. We're going to take New York and then isolate New England from the rest of the colonies. So we'll take New York. So they went to New York City and captured New York. They caught George Washington on Long Island. If anyone knows about New York, Long Island is now part of New York City. They went to Long Island where Washington was, and they soundly defeated Washington. And the war would have ended right there. But a lot of people say divine providence took over. A very thick fog came up. And General General Howe decided not to try to fight in a fog. I mean, he realized my men might bump into each other and start shooting each other. They can't tell friend from foe. So he ordered his men to stop, which might have been the wisest move to do. So while his men were stopped advancing, Washington took his men through the fog, got to the edge of the island, and then he ordered every boat on the island to be moved, including the boats that they didn't need. That way, when the fog lifted, the British saw they had no boats. Well, that was only a temporary setback, because the British had the largest navy in the world, and of course they'd come. Howe didn't worry about, okay, Howe said to himself, well, okay, so the man is smart, he took all the boats and we can't follow now, but I'll get Washington later. Well, eventually Howe got the boats he needed and crossed out of Long Island. And then Howe began to drive Washington into Philadelphia, and Howe kept pushing. Now, I had a young man this morning ask, how could Washington take defeat after defeat and keep on fighting? He did, folk. That's all he did. Now later on, Lincoln was to have to go through the same thing, to go through defeat in his after defeat in his personal life, lost one election after another, then got to be president, then had to see his armies take one defeat after another. Washington had the same thing. I may have told you. If you look at George Washington's won-loss record, he won in his lifetime 4 battles and lost about 14. Sounds like not so good of a record, but he won his last battle. And that's something Napoleon, who is a contemporary of Washington, Napoleon couldn't say that if he were here. Napoleon won 40 victories at least, but he lost his last one. Napoleon goes down as a loser, Washington goes down as a winner. But he took defeat after defeat. Washington was chased to Philadelphia. And then Howe, all right, General Howe, he had a problem. I used to tell this to my 10-year-old students. He just didn't know how. He could have ended the war right there, but instead he made the mistake that other Britishers were to make. Winter was setting in, so Howe settled down and decided to winter there in Philadelphia and where it was comfortable. So he wintered in Philadelphia. Washington did not sit down even though it was winter. He sneaked in on Christmas Eve night. The enlistments of most of his men were going to run out on New Year's Day, or New Year's Eve rather. So he had a week where his men were there, but he slipped across the Delaware River and captured 1,000 British Hessians. Now the Hessians were actually German, whom the King of England had hired to fight against them. And the King of England, by hiring troops to fight, it really made him unpopular. But he hired some German soldiers. Some of these Germans were captured by Washington on Christmas Eve, and this influenced most of Washington's men then to re-up or sign up again for another hitch with the army. Otherwise, Washington's men might have gone home. Now, there's a famous picture of Washington crossing the Delaware, and the picture shows Washington standing straight and tall in a rowboat. Folk, don't do that. I have to admit, I did it. But anyway, don't you do that. He is standing straight and tall in a rowboat. And also there's a bunch of ice floating down the Delaware River. Nobody would cross a river that has a bunch of ice chips floating down it, because 90% of the ice is underwater, as the people in the Titanic found out. And the rowboat would have been dashed to pieces. But nevertheless, it's a famous painting that shows Washington and his men struggling to get across in the cold weather, with Washington standing straight and tall and his men struggling to get across the river. Makes for good painting, but it's not quite real. Anyway, he crossed the Delaware River, captured 1,000 Hessians. The British Army thought that Washington was celebrating Christmas. He was wrong. I mean, the British Army was wrong. Well, time went on. There was a lot of financial corruption that went on. Some people can find a way to really profit from other people's disasters, and some people really high up in their own government would sometimes make a profit selling to persons who really couldn't afford to pay, and getting persons pretty deep in debt. And we'll talk a little bit about one man who did this, named Benedict Arnold, but a lot of others were just as guilty. Some people got rich from the war. Some people can make a profit off of other people's turmoil and troubles. So there was a lot of corruption that went on. Inflation, a big problem. Inflation is worth something that's worth $1 today is worth $2 tomorrow and $5 next week. You know, the value of the money gets less and less as time goes on. Now, during my own lifetime, we had a real issue with inflation under President Jimmy Carter. I mean, Jimmy Carter's a Georgian, and maybe somebody don't love it. Inflation was a big issue under President Carter. Since we found ways to keep it somewhat in check. All right. Now, in 1777, the early part of it, the colonials faced a really bleak future. Things were really going badly for the colonials. And nobody quite knew what to do. In the meantime, the British had met, and they got 3 British generals together. And these British generals decided we're going to attack Albany. We've already got New York, so we're going to attack Albany. So General Howe was to come up from the south and attack Albany from the south. Coming down from Canada was to be General Burgoyne. And coming from the west, also from Canada, but from West Africa, was to be St. Leger. They were going to hit the city of Albany. And you think Albany's going to get it. Does anybody in here, in the other class, a couple of how many British soldiers actually reached Albany? Does anybody know? Nobody? Not one. Not one. General St. Leger marched toward Albany. He'd march along, and all of a sudden they'd hear a bang, and a British soldier would drop down. March a few more feet, and they'd hear another bang, and a British soldier would drop down. The British were being sniped at by colonials from behind, and they didn't know where the colonials were. I mean, also the colonials would take one shot they had and take off running. By the time the British got ready to react, the colonials were gone. They marched on, and people wondered after a while just which one of us is going to be next. Make a long story short, St. Leger turned around and went back to Canada. I'm very on this. Can't get there. But here was the big one. Burgoyne marched along, and he got waylaid also. And then finally, at a place called Saratoga, Burgoyne was whipped to his knees and forced to surrender. There was a book published many years ago, 10 Most Decisive Battles in World History. The Battle of Saratoga was that one. With the victory at Saratoga, and by the way, George Washington was not there, but with the victory at Saratoga, that influenced the King of France to side with the colonials. Now, the French owed the English one. Under the King of France's father, the King of France was Louis XVI. Under Louis XV, France had lost a war with England. So this would be a chance for the French to get vengeance. The problem was the King of France was a very indecisive man and had to be convinced it was worth his while to help the colonials. But with the victory of the colonials at Saratoga, the King of France became convinced. So the King of France began to get his army and navy ready. All right, this was in late 1777. The French army did arrive, but it took them till 1781. In the movie The Patriot, the hero of the story is heard saying, "The long-awaited help of the French finally arrived." It did, and just in time too. But it took a while. But anyway, in 1781, the army. But anyway, thanks to Saratoga, the French king was persuaded. Ben Franklin was sent from Philadelphia to Saratoga to negotiate. And there's a story that John Paul Jones, who founded the Navy, realized that the fastest way to get from the colonies to France was to take a very northerly route. The earth is round, and today an airplane going to England will go all the way up to Iceland and back down. If you look at the globe, you know what I mean. John Paul Jones took a northerly route, and he thought he was going to be the first one to tell Ben Franklin that we'd won the battle at Saratoga. He got to France, and he was very disappointed. Another fast ship had beaten him there. The fast ship had taken a more southerly route. John Paul Jones had to fight icebergs and storms and heavy winds and bad weather. The more southerly route was a calmer route. The ship beat him there by half a day. And Jones was disappointed. I said, I'm sorry to tell you, but I know this already. Anyway, that's a little bit of a side story. But anyway, Saratoga, big turning point in the war. Now, as for Howe, who didn't know Howe, anyway, that's something else. Howe decided, St. Ledger and Burgoyne, they can take Albany. I'm going to Philadelphia. So instead of going to Albany like he was supposed to, Howe had the biggest army that Britain had at the time. He turned his army south to Philadelphia. He took Philadelphia from Washington all right. But when the Battle of Saratoga was lost, and when Albany got off scot-free, everybody in all of England criticized Howe severely, and Howe received a bunch of sharply critical letters. Howe resigned. He said, all right, they don't appreciate what I've done. I took Philadelphia. Yes, Mr. Howe, but you were supposed to have gone to Albany. If he had gone to Albany, St. Ledger might not have given up. Burgoyne might have kept on traveling, knowing that receiving reinforcements when he got to Albany. As it was, he took off for Philadelphia. The British lost the whole war. Well, Clinton took over at that point. George Washington and General Clinton never actually engaged each other. Instead, they both sat on opposite sides of the river and spent about 3 years, each of them watching each other. Washington watching Clinton, Clinton watching Washington, without any more serious engagement with each other. So that at this point, the war turned to the south. And Georgia became prominently figured in on it also. Now, in the South, the Congress was tired of Washington losing all the battles, so they kept him on as commander, but they sent a general down there to the South they sent General Gage, who was, I'm not going to write his name because he did not become one of America's heroes, but he was given credit for winning at Saratoga. Now, if you actually look in detail at the Battle of Saratoga, General Gates had almost nothing to do with winning the battle. The battle was actually won by his subordinates, men like Benedict Arnold for one, but he was given the credit undeservedly. Anyway, General Gates engaged the British, and before the battle got good and started, he panicked and he turned and he ran pell-mell from the battlefield, which is why he did not become one of America's heroes. And if you're in a military situation, what do you do when your top-ranking officer runs pell-mell from the battlefield? The entire army ran. I mean, it's just what you do. I mean, if you see your top general running, maybe you think he knows something I don't know, and the army doesn't tell you anything, by the way, but maybe he knows something, so they all ran. Big loss. Well, the Continental Congress still did not trust Washington, so they sent a man named General Lincoln. General Lincoln took the biggest army the colonials ever had and met with Cornwallis, who by this time was sent south while Clinton was up in the north. And General Lincoln lost also. And this was a really bad time for the colonials because they were losing badly. Well, next time the Continental Congress knew they couldn't raise much of an army, they asked General Washington, fine, who do you choose? Washington chose General Nathaniel Greene. I'll just write Greene's name. General Greene. Before it was over, everybody knew why. Well, General Greene knew that with his small army, he could not take on Cornwallis. And Cornwallis knew, if I can crush Greene, the war's over. I've defeated these people twice. Well, General Greene started on a run. How is this? Well, it turned out that was the best strategy he had, was to run. So Cornwallis ordered his men, said, burn all your tents, get rid of all your extra clothes, get rid of everything you don't need. We're going to run after him pell-mell. If we can catch him, the war's over. Problem was, Cornwallis nor his men knew anything about the territory. General Greene did. General Greene could outrun him. At one point, Cornwallis got so close to Greene that Cornwallis got to a river, and there was Greene's army. The last of his troops had just gone on the other side. Cornwallis had no boats. So Greene's army taunted the British while the British got together a bunch of rafts, and by the time the British got ready to float across the river, Greene and his men had disappeared. By the time the last of Cornwallis and got across, Greene was miles away. This went on for a while, and after a while, Greene's General Cornwallis's army got very tired and they ran out of supplies, and Cornwallis had been whipped. So he started to march back to the coastline, where he was promised some British ships would be waiting for him. So he marched his men to the coastline, and the colonials followed him. General Greene was ordered to go to Charleston and retake Charleston, which he went and started to do, but actually the war ended before he actually finished taking Charleston. General Greene is one of America's heroes. Unfortunately, he only lived a short time, a few months after the war ended, died rather quickly of disease. This took away so many people. But General Greene is remembered as being the man who outsmarted, if he didn't defeat Cornwallis in open battle. But Cornwallis went on to Yorktown, and I'm sorry, folk, I don't have an eraser. Now, Yorktown was a little peninsula-like, extruding out the ocean, and there at Yorktown, there'd be some British ships waiting for him. Yes, there were. Now there was one problem. The long-awaited help from the French finally arrived. The French Navy got right here, and they fought against the British and whipped the British and forced the British ships to go farther out in the sea, where they were of no help whatever to Cornwallis. So Cornwallis went to Yorktown to find the French Navy was there waiting for him. So he was surrounded by sea. Cornwallis wrote a letter to his buddy up in New York, to General Clinton, saying, please help me. General Clinton said, okay, now I understand you're in a predicament. I'll get down there sometime. But anyway, basically, to make a long story short, General Clinton did not move from New York very fast. If General Clinton, but that's one of the ifs, what if General Clinton had gotten right away, gotten his army and moved from New York? He didn't. Well, in the meantime, the colonials began surrounding Cornwallis, but he didn't have enough men to completely cut him off. Cornwallis could have left. He wrote another letter to General Clinton. General Clinton said, yeah, just hold out, I'll be back. I'll come down there. He didn't. Well, in the meantime, the American general sent a letter to Washington and said, we don't have enough men to finish him off. If you can get down here with your army. So George Washington pulled one of his more foxy moves. He pretended he was going to Long Island. He made some moves toward Long Island. Then he hurriedly turned around before the British knew what had happened. He turned away from Long Island and started to move south. Some French ships were waiting for him there in Philadelphia, so he rode in ships from Philadelphia. And keep in mind, a ship can travel day and night and make 20 miles a day easily. There's no way a land army can do that. In short order, George Washington and his men were in Yorktown, and then he began to surround Cornwallis. Washington and his men had some 16 to 17,000 men. Cornwallis had 7,000. And at this point, all of Cornwallis's avenue of retreat was cut off. General Cornwallis wrote a letter to General Clinton, my position is dire. Unless you can come here right away, I am going to be forced to take drastic measures. General Clinton stayed in New York. Didn't want to leave for some reason, folk. Well, George Washington began closing in. General Cornwallis met with some of his men, and all of his officers met with his officers. All of his officers in turn said, we have to surrender. My men, the men over here, they can't hold out. They're outnumbered. The next officer said, my men here are outnumbered. My men here are outnumbered. Cornwallis knew this already. Cornwallis called in Washington to offer terms of surrender. They discussed it. I've heard that there was a bunch of shouting that went back and forth between you, but the fact is, Washington had the upper hand. Cornwallis agreed to surrender. When it came time for the surrender ceremonies, Cornwallis pretended to be sick and wouldn't come out. So one of his top officers handed the sword over. The sword wound up, according to what I just recently read, wound up back in the hands of the British. Washington initially took it. Washington handed it to General Lincoln to make General Lincoln feel better for the big loss he'd suffered. Anyway, at the ceremony, the British fleet that was sitting out here out in the ocean were allowed to come in to take their men home. The British soldiers marched. Some of them had their faces covered. They were crying. Now, folk, a lot of grown men will cry when they lose a football game. Men will cry when they lose the World Series. And, and it's hard on a man to be a part of an army that's losing. But on a given note, they were beating the drums, and according to what I've heard, they were beating to the tune of "The World's Turned Upside Down." On a given note, all the British men dropped their rifles. That was customary in those days. Basically, Washington and his men got all the British rifles, all the British heavy artillery, and all the British bayonets, all this stuff. The men got on board the British ships, including Cornwallis, and went back to England. 5 days later, General Clinton arrived, but General Clinton did not have enough men to take on the French and the Americans, so there was no fighting. Instead, they waited 2 years for peace. Now, folk, before I conclude this part of the war, there's one other episode that I must mention. While Washington was sitting up there across New York, watching General Clinton, and General Clinton watching him, one of Washington's top officers began to negotiate with the British. Man's name was Benedict Arnold. If you read the lesson, you know Benedict Arnold goes down in history alongside of the name Judas Iscariot. If you know anything about the Bible, you've not heard of Judas. Judas betrayed Jesus. Benedict Arnold betrayed his country. Benedict Arnold told the British, now, hey, I've gotten control of West Point, and I'll give you West Point if in turn you'll exonerate me. And he worked up some deals with the British. General Clinton was reluctant. He didn't quite think it would work, but nevertheless, here was his chance, he thought, to close out the war. Benedict Arnold said, now I know I'm in cahoots with Washington, and I know all Washington's plans. Washington tells me everything he's going to do. Washington trusts me. Now, what was wrong with Benedict Arnold? We think that, well, number one, he was corrupt. He made a lot of money selling rum to people who couldn't afford to buy it, but he didn't mind pocketing money from very, very poor people. He also had married a woman who was the daughter of a British judge and who was known to be a British sympathizer. So here he was, a top officer in the Continental Army, married to a British sympathizer. That might have influenced him. Whatever. He tried to betray West Point, which was very strategic, even though today West Point is the nation's top military. But he tried to betray West Point to the British. But the British Army sent Major Andre to Benedict Arnold one day. So Major Andre had this letter. But Major Andre was disguised as a poor colonial and not as a British officer. And a bunch of three men intending to rob Major Andre stopped him. Major Andre said, now please, I'm on an important mission for the Continental Army. I mean, I'm really a Continental. Can you please let me go on a mission? The men determined to get money from him. So the men strip searched him, you might say, and of the three men, one of them could read. The other two couldn't. This man found some papers, the paper that General Clinton had used to write to Benedict Arnold. And this man, well, hey, this person, he's a traitor. So they took Major Andre to General Washington. General Washington read the letter and ordered Major Andre be killed, executed, which he was the next day. And in the meantime, they sent a bunch of men to arrest Benedict Arnold. But some private who did not know that Benedict Arnold was involved went and told him, sir, we've caught a major traitor. Some man pretending to be a private U.S. citizen was actually a British officer, and he was on his way to betray West Point. Didn't know they were talking to the man who told Benedict Arnold did not know he was talking to the man who was actually in charge trying to betray West Point. Benedict Arnold knew that they'd be coming after him, so he hurriedly got on his horse and he galloped off, but he was just on the edge of the woods when the American colonials came in to arrest him. The problem was Benedict Arnold was on a horse, the American colonials was on foot. They never caught him. Benedict Arnold rode behind the British lines and stayed there the rest of the war. And Benedict Arnold learned the hard way, nobody likes a man who betrays his country. The British blamed Benedict Arnold for the death of Major Andre. When the war was over, Benedict Arnold had to go to England. He couldn't come back. He was never able to come back to the colonies. And he died. And he became mentally, he might say he was suffering from Alzheimer's in his later years, but he found out he wished he had never betrayed his country. All right. Your book goes into why the British lost. One of the reasons your book says was the British Army did not want to forage for food. They wanted to get their food from England, and this was highly expensive. If the British Army had gone to the colonials and stolen the food from the colonials, but the British were afraid that, well, this might alienate the people who are loyal to us, so they didn't do it. Folk, I don't like what I'm about to say. Leo de Rocher, a famous manager from when I was a kid, said, "Nice guys finish last." During the Civil War, the Confederates tried to treat the Union